This is going to be a very brief presentation of some of my ideas from my book called Occupy World Street. Just in a way of background, my background is actually partly in the private sector as a management consultant for many years, particularly in the finance area, but also about 30 years also active in the NGO world, in particular as regards GEN and Gaia education. Now, one reason I wrote this book was because it became clear to me that if we're going to solve the problems facing us on the planet, we have to work both from the top down and from the bottom up. And the work we're doing here in the Ecovillage Movement is the bottom up. And what I'm going to talk to you about here today is mostly the other side, the top down. What kind of changes are necessary in the outside world that will make it easier to make a transformation to a more sustainable future. Now, this first diagram is taken from the IPCC report of 2014, and it shows the increase in carbon dioxide emissions over the period since about 1970 until 2012, 2013 approximately. The important point to realize here is that the amount of emissions has been increasing every single year. Note that even after the Rio conference in 1992, and since then, it's been increasing. In spite of all the good intentions of governments, in spite of all of the non-binding agreements, in spite of all the goals to reduce CO2 emissions, they continue to increase year after year. The message is clear that the governments of this world are not able to or not willing to make the necessary changes. What can we conclude from this? Well, the probability is that if this continues, that we're going to end up in a very dramatic downturn in the economic world, in the production world, with very severe consequences. This diagram here confirms the same idea. That this is the ecological footprint of the whole world, the global footprint, which shows that we're actually, compared to the green line, which is one Earth, we're using about 50% more resources than the Earth can provide us with each year. This is obviously not sustainable. Now, from my point of view, some of the major problems making it difficult to find solutions are these international institutions, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank and the EU. All of these institutions are basically promoting an economic model that rewards companies that exploit the environment, penalizes companies that try to be sustainable. And so if we're going to change the world, we're going to have to begin with looking at the economic system that's behind it. Unfortunately, this is very, very difficult because the people who are in charge are very much committed to continuing with this model. Very briefly, this diagram here illustrates what the current power structure of the world is, seen in a very schematic way. And at the very top, we have what we could call the corporatocracy, which is a network of large, primarily American, but also international corporations and their shareholders, who basically are, in the United States at least, in charge of everything. They basically have so much influence now that they are basically in control of the Congress, which also controls, of course, the administration. And it controls also these four institutions indirectly, which are primarily extensions of American interests. At the very bottom, we have 7 billion world citizens who have very little influence as to what's happening. If we're going to have a sustainable future, we have to make some significant changes. And one of the most important ones is to change the economic system to what I would call ecological economics. That means we're putting the environment ahead of the economy, not the way it is today, but it's the other way around. It means we have to replace these international institutions with other institutions which have a much more an objective which is in keeping with the needs of human beings and not just profitable corporations. So what we have to do is take back control of our economies. Taking back control means taking control of the goods flows into the country. It means control of the capital flows, which, by the way, are a fundamental right of every country. We have to take control of we have to challenge the WTO and the EU. The EU, by the way, does not allow member countries to have controls on capital flow. And this is one of the things that has to be changed. And a final thing we have to do to take control of our economy is to have a different kind of a currency environment where we actually can manage a floating type currency. Now, in my book, I suggest a possible way that we might reorganize our international economic political situation is that some of the smaller countries might get together and actually form an alternative solution, an alternative way to organize things internationally. I call it the Galan League. And in this model, which is a very ideal model, the only areas in which it's necessary to cede sovereignty to a central organization would be in the areas of sustainability and human rights. In other words, each country, each nation state would have to give up the right to control these two things in order to have a sustainable planet. Everything else would be decentralized and would be up to the individual nation states to determine. In order to do this, we have to establish a number of new institutions. In fact, 8 new institutions in my model. And the initiative to do this is going to have to come from some of the smaller states, because the large states like the United States, the EU and China and so on, they're not interested in this kind of change at all. So we have to have a number of new institutions. I have in my book a description of them. I won't have time to go into them today, but one of the most important ones is a new trade organization. Now, one question you could ask is, how can we envisage going from here to there? And my suggestion is what I call this breakaway strategy. And that is that some of these smaller states, perhaps only 6 or 7, get together and form a new kind of organization, which I call the Galan League. They leave the WTO, and they adopt the institutions which I've mentioned, and say, from now on to the rest of the world, we're going to do things differently. We're going to do things our way. We're going to prioritize sustainability above all else, and invite others to join. Now, here's where the grassroots come in. If we imagine that some of these small countries actually form such an organization, then a lot of the minorities in countries like the United States and the EU could say to their governments, why are we not a member? Let us join. This way they could pressure their governments to accept the idea of joining such a new entity and defy their political leadership, which is not interested. In other words, demand a referendum. The last question, or the last issue I just want to briefly mention is, what is the role in all of this of the Ecovillage movement? Well, certainly, from my point of view, the Ecovillage movement represents what I might call islands of the future. If we are heading for a breakdown, international breakdown in the economic system, then these eco-villages around the world could be a place to rebuild, a place where people could go in order to start to build a new culture based on decentralized cooperation and a diversity of cultures. I think our diversity of cultures is the most important human legacy that we have to offer the world, and I think this is the thing that is so important that we preserve in this new model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross.